Hello, everyone around the world. Welcome. Bienvenidos, que calos irfete, to Coloring My Way Across the Globe. I'm your host, Lauren Battistini, color consultant, artist, language learner, and world traveler. Join me each week as I chronicle the most colorful people, places, and experiences I encounter off the beaten path, both near and far. So, let's go. Vámonos, que pame. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Coloring My Way Across the Globe. We are on part 2 of our series with our guest, Reverend Dennis Flach, who happens to be my dad also. So you'll hear me either say Reverend Flach or Dad throughout the episode. So welcome back to the podcast,
Thanks,
Dad, Reverend Flach.
Thank you, Lauren.
It's a pleasure, as always, to have you here. For those of you who did not hear or see part 1 of this interview, it was entitled New Orleans of Yesteryear to Natchez of Today, in which we discussed my dad's early childhood growing up in New Orleans, Louisiana, and then his adult years here in Natchez, Mississippi. And be sure to listen to that episode. And today we'll be delving into some other aspects of my dad's life. But before we do, there's one small footnote from part 1 we failed to mention. And Dad, what was that about World War II in particular in New Orleans at that time?
Yes, New Orleans bore a very important role in World War II. And the whole aspect of World War II, like every community receiving its soldiers back at the conclusion of the war, there were transitions. I mean, we hear about transitions today with Iraq veterans returning, Afghanistan veterans. The Middle East has produced so many veterans. So it's consequential when you come back. It's consequential to answer the question, can you resume normal life? And what would that look like after having fought for your country? In our case, New Orleans consisted of men cutting their grass, washing their cars, painting their homes, making lives, having children, going out the door with a briefcase or a bag of tools, and working again and resuming what we would call normal life. They were all around us growing up, us kids growing up, us boys with imagination wondering what did they go through, what were their stories, overwhelmed me with admiration and respect. And it was a people and examples of men that we've never seen the likes of, even to today. It was incredible with their stories that they would rarely share, but when they did, you knew that their adjustments were significant and their contributions to the life of this country were significant. And so I was always touched by that. When you see film about the invasion of Europe, that means the invasion of Western Europe at Normandy. You see little small boats being launched from larger boats, loaded with men and supplies, standing in a wooden-hulled small boat called a Higgins landing craft as they made their way to machine gun bristling shores of Normandy. The only protection they had was the ramp in front that served as the bow of the boat. And when that bow was dropped, all protection vanished. Machine gun fire came into those boats, ripping men apart and killing them. It was the bravest of the brave that landed at Normandy. These were the men that surrounded me as a child, teaching me how to play baseball or basketball, teaching us how to fish, taking us fishing, taking time. These were the men that did that, the likes of whom we will never see again. Those Higgins boats, by the way, were produced in New Orleans. New Orleans made the Higgins boats. The Higgins boats were named after the manufacturer that sat on the Industrial Canal Bridge, a little small bridge that carried you and all of the traffic on Highway 90, the Chef-Menteur Highway, out east towards the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Higgins produced those boats, and those boats achieved incredible ends by putting together the bravest army that invaded Western Europe that the world had ever seen. It was truly remarkable to stand and be around those men and to hold on to every syllable of those few stories that they were willing to let go of. Truly wonderful.
Thank you for sharing that, Dad. This endearing part of your childhood.
Yes.
Impactful, a piece of history, very significant post World War II, post World War II. Let's delve into this week's topic.
Sure.
We've got a few topics. I'd like you to introduce yourself to my audience and talk to us about your career your ministerial career, your vocation, how it started, and just give us a little bit of an introduction here, please.
First of all, my work has been involved under the heading of Christianity, with the idea that God calls people to do different things, sometimes requiring even to be ordained to certain kinds of work that would be representing the interest of Christianity. So it's for followers of Jesus Christ that rises to the top of concern and focus. But I was a young adult convert to Christianity. I was in my early 30s when I became persuaded that Jesus Christ really was the eternal Son of God, and that I had a record that was deplorable in view of a holy God. And he was irreproachable in his holiness and purity and truthfulness. And I stood apart and unable to do anything about that. Sin really does disable the human family and members in it. And I was no different than the rest of humanity. We were all disqualified from being able to be treated as sons of a king. And so that was the beginning, and that was to come into the life of following Christ and believing in the gospel that saves and believing in my need for a Savior. That was at a personal level. That was also implied to be in the family level. We made every effort to explain the gospel to our children, Lauren and Andrew, and we're dearly gratified of their acceptance of their Savior and their life of change and purpose. And there's nothing like it. I've not experienced anything like it. I had a secular career that had some successes in it. But over the years, approaching going to seminary, preparing for ministry formally, there were some failures along the way and some things that really humbled me and caused me to second guess myself and be much less sure in this world, and to be much more humbled by the circumstances that sometimes overtook me. I call them the hard left turns of life, and I had quite a number of those. And I faced seminary as almost a decision of last resort. But I went thinking all the way back to childhood. I did attend parochial schools in New Orleans. I mean, oftentimes to be a New Orleanian is to be Roman Catholic in upbringing. That was not my path to Christianity. But I will admit that under that system, I was drawn towards the priesthood with the idea of ministering to people in some kind of religious way. And so that was that's the early germ of it. But as an adult, it's another matter with family, with children, whether that can be pulled off or not. And mercifully, it did get pulled off, and I did finish a theological seminary education, which was a great one, out of Jackson, Mississippi, through Reformed Theological Seminary. And it was great qualification, great preparation for the work. But there's nothing like getting behind a pulpit. There's nothing like assuming the role in a church, which I did for 3 years in Jackson, Mississippi. There was a group of people in Natchez, Mississippi, however, that were attempting to plant a church. They wanted particularly a Presbyterian church, which was pretty much my theological background as an adult, learning more about Christianity. And so I did accept the invitation to come. They did want me to come to organize the first ever church of its kind. There was a group of people. We met at the Jewish synagogue, Temple B'nai Israel, and it is right across from the public library in Natchez, Mississippi. It's a historic place.
It's beautiful.
The Jewish community was wonderful. It's a very small congregation, unable really to support full-time rabbi. but they were very dear to us, and many of the people in our original group of interested people forming a church, they were friends with some of these because they were fellow business people in the community. But it was a wonderful experience to worship there. We did that for over a year. We then went to another temporary location for about 3 months, but we ended up for temporary facilities at a building called the old bank building, the old National Bank building, and it was on the corner of Canal and Main Street. We now have, well, anyway, it was perfect. It had pillars and all of that. It looked very churchy.
It did look churchy.
And it worked for us. And we were there for several years until such time as we came into sufficient funds to acquire land to build a structure, our first ever structures, which were two. It was a chapel-sized sanctuary as well as a small educational building. And that served us well and continues to serve us well in Natchez. So the Presbyterian Church was established. It was called New Covenant Presbyterian Church. There were a number of different Presbyterian bodies out there. I was in one. The next pastor came in, and there was a desire to switch to another, which had certain aspects different from my denomination. But it continues as a well-grounded church now, and I think that my wife and myself and those early pioneers of forming a church really did a good job overall laying a foundation that I think is in place today, and absolutely taking nothing away from the obvious achievements that are occurring now with the newest pastor, Reverend Franklin, and he's John Franklin, and he's doing a wonderful job there. We're so proud of him, consider him a friend, and we often have the occasion to laugh and drink coffee together.
Well, Dad, Reverend Flach, some people who did not hear the first episode might not know that you hold 2 degrees. You've got your Master's of Special Education and, of course, your Master's of Divinity with a focus in church planting and missions.
That's right.
So I have a question for you from an entrepreneurial standpoint.
Okay.
Since I'm an entrepreneur, I thought back on those years of your church planting here in Natchez and watching the church grow. And I thought to myself recently that there are some parallels between church planting and entrepreneurship. I feel that you do have to have somewhat of an entrepreneurial mindset to undergo such a process of planting a church. Could you share with me, do you agree with that perspective?
For the most part, I really do. I think that there are things that work in the business world that also work in the world of church. And by that, I mean the mechanics, the organization, the physical attention, the demands of engaging, the demands of negotiating, finding common ground, overcoming difficulties or obstacles. Right. All of those go in, and that's an entrepreneurial spirit that cuts across a lot of different disciplines, but it's inherently in organizing other organizations, pulling things together, bringing things that were not into existence.
That's right. There's a creative aspect to it.
There is, and so at the very least in church work. I mean, let me just say that church work takes this approach differently in this way.
Yes.
It's a volunteer organization. The people that become associated with churches are voluntarily in that. There is no hierarchical control of salaries and benefits and that sort of thing, where you have some leverage in certain instances, where disciplinary practices can be very quick and no nonsense. But in the world of church, and in the world where church is to serve others, it stops being the for-profit entrepreneurial focus.
That's correct.
It becomes the focus of compassion for the circumstances that people live in, for the shortcomings that people can be discovered to have and be discovered in. Sometimes that's, making a lot of bad mistakes, making a lot of bad choices. Some of them just sticking to that plan, no matter what guidance pastorally we might give. Others were teachable and truly believe that life can be better and they can be contributors to better life
Mm-hmm.
and better community. And the attachments and the affections can grow. And a more peaceable, more compassionate community following Jesus Christ can come into existence to make a difference. It doesn't need to be harsh. It doesn't need to be condemnation. It needs to have some heart and warmth and care to it.
I enjoy hearing your insights from the Christian perspective as well. So you are retired from full-time ministry, but you have continued full-time pastoral ministry, but you have
That's right.
continued preaching on Sundays out of town.
I hardly see a difference.
At a smaller congregation. I feel that we, especially we as Christians, and I am a strong Christian believer, our ministry is wherever we happen to be standing, be it in a church setting or a work environment. I'm referring to your pastoral work, and you have in these last years been going every week to preach, just in the pulpit to smaller congregations. And I would like to discuss. To me, this is very endearing. This you're going into these congregations where due to the decrease in population of some of these places, the congregation itself is just also dwindled. But these churches still want to keep their doors open, and they have purpose, and they certainly deserve to have a minister in the pulpit preaching God's word on Sundays.
That's highly desirable in my view as well. You want me to speak to that?
I would like you to share what your experience has been in some of the smaller congregations and what you've enjoyed most about it.
Well, first of all, I didn't think I would enjoy, at the start of ministry, I didn't think I would enjoy a small congregation. In fact, people were identifying me, along with my wife, Mary, as a couple in ministry that needs to be involved with big church ministry. And, that affected the mind, that affected the size, the hat size. There was a tendency to swell over that kind of view. Being entrepreneurial to plant a church caused me on more than one occasion to feel that the only way this is going to be worthwhile doing is if it gets big. Well, Natchez, when I came late 96, was in the stages of decline. I think we've stabilized the decline now. Mayor Dan Gibson, who we spoke about last time, was someone that is really having a positive impact on the growth of this city once again, and the good decision making that our board, working with Dan, the kind of decision they make are sensible and sound and good and teaming and cooperative and beneficial. So I will say that in the early stages, trying to be entrepreneurial, I got caught up in numbers. And I remember when 9/11 took place, you would not believe, after those planes flew into our trade towers, at the loss of 3,000 plus lives, and the decimation and destruction and the breaking in our hearts that we felt, the cruelties that we observed, the unimaginable acts that were against us. They really took place, and they were devastating. Well, you could imagine the streets of Natchez. I felt like the chaplain sitting in the middle of my congregation, being Natchez. Everywhere I went, people would come to me and say, "What does all this mean? Speak to us about how God could let something like this happen." And one thing led to another, and those conversations to the man or woman led to, "I will see you at your church, your little temporary facilities at the old bank building. We'll see you there where you guys are worshiping. We want to hear more about this. And we want to know something about God in the midst of this kind of dilemma." And I told, when asked by the church officers, how many seats should we put out into our rented sanctuary? I said, Easter plus crowds. Prepare for Easter plus. It's another way of saying we're going to have good attendance and then some, beyond our normal, regular, average worship attendance. And in those days, being the entrepreneur of entrepreneurs, I could tell you in any month what the average worship attendance was, month by month. And so I looked at what it was a year ago, and I knew that we'd have plus Easter plus crowds, much more than the average a year ago. And do you know what we had that Sunday that followed 9/11? We only had 80% of average worship attendance. Did those people lie to me in the streets? Was I deluded? What happened to that fervor? Where did it go? Could you get over that quick? And it was not pursued. And it caused me to step away from the numbers or being moved by the numbers, high or low, in any worship. And I stopped being influenced by that. So fast forward, after, almost 30 years, it was actually 18 years that I completed with this church planting here. But I took on serving, as long as pointing out, other churches in my denomination that had transitioning of pastors, of those leaving for another church, a vacancy for a while. I would serve those churches till I got another pastor. And because I was retired by virtue of reaching the age of 70, that's what we did. We just served those places where there were gaps and spaces in the pulpit ministries of those churches. And then I was invited to attend a small church in a little community of about 500 people in Meadville, and went there and have been there for almost 8 years now. And I preach the same way, whether it's a 1,000-member church or whether it's a 12-member church. And I'm more in that scale of ministry right now. But I love it because I love the Word. I've seen the impact of lives being changed through pastoral ministry, through the use of the pulpit, the Scriptures presented truthfully, and lives being changed. And they, of the 12-ish numbers that attend, they deserve it. They want it, and they need it. And I'm more than willing to show up and provide it.
And they're appreciative of it. I was just at the church in Meadville where you preached. I was with my parents on Sunday, and I got to see the dynamic there and visit the church and experience the service. And there are the old hymnals that I'm so familiar with, songs that I've sung from years past in church. So it was a beautiful experience. And also with modern day technology that we have, your sermons are able to be recorded as well for whomever wants to view the service. So that's been a bit of your life with church planting and your continued service in the pulpit. Let's talk a little bit about your mission work, because that was one of the focuses when you were studying for your master's in divinity. You have traveled internationally, sometimes for personal vacation reasons, but oftentimes for different missions and leadership purposes. So there are a few places you had mentioned to me that I'd like to highlight during this podcast, one of which is Malawi. And I'm interested to know why you went and maybe some interesting cultural things you discovered while you were there.
Well, one of the members of our denomination works in the town in Malawi called Lilongwe. And he teaches at what is called the African Bible College and Seminary. It also has a clinic there, but it serves Malawian people in the capital city of Lilongwe. And he invited me to come and be the keynote speaker for their annual revitalization conference. I don't remember what they called it, to be honest with you. But it would be to speak for, each day, a couple of times a day in the course of a week, to speak to the student body, which was overwhelmingly Malawans. The students there were Malawans. Many of the students had graduated from their program, served in governmental positions, and the Christian perspective that they bring to the position they hold have been very well received. This seminary and Bible college is sending people out into very fruitful labors and influencing the very life of the nation. There's corruption that goes on there. They're impoverished people. They were once part of the British colonial system. They were left with no easy transitions, and they went from dominant rule by Great Britain to self-rule in the midst of confusion. And so there have been different premiers of Malawi that left with the treasury, leaving them more impoverished. It's one of the poorest, if not the poorest, in all of continental Africa. So I was invited to be there, and I had a wonderful time preaching, and I loved it. Dr. Larry Brown was the one that invited me. He's one of the members in my denomination, serving as a missionary and as an instructor at that Bible college in Malawi. And it was fun to be there. There was some wonderful experiences and things. I mean, we visited prisons and preached and taught there at prisons, and they are mean places. Young children are in prison as well as, 40-something-year-old criminals. They're all mixed and mingled together. I'm sure justice is not swift, and I'm sure it's quite partial. But Larry does a wonderful job there, and he wanted me to see part of it. And I had a chance to visit a hospital, and I had a chance to kind of revive some of my interest in infants and infant feedings, and having worked at one time for Mead Johnson, an infant formula company, I knew a lot about premature formulas and those sorts of things, and had a chance to learn what they were doing. The hospital would take care of newborns and high-risk babies. It would take care of the elderly, all the people in between. And when you look up, all you could see is a corrugated roof that must have been used some other place, because it had nail holes. And when the rains came, it dripped into the patient's rooms or the operating rooms. So there were some real needs there, genuine needs. And Larry is there laboring in a place that is often forgotten, often neglected. And he's there day in and day out. And I so admired what he does, and I love him for it. And I was honored to be able to be part of that for a while.
Thank you for sharing about the Malawi experience. Another place you visited is Cuba. Why were you there? And I'm interested in some cultural components of Cuba as well.
You're listening to Coloring My Way Across the Globe with Lauren Battistini. For more information, check out lfbcolor.com.
Well, in addition to your church experience there.
As you know, Lauren, my birth father was a Spaniard. He was from his parents were from Spain. They moved to the United States, New York, and they had 3 children between New York City, Tampa, Florida, and ultimately the family ended up in Cuba. And so I knew that I had this Cuban connection by way of my natural father. I didn't know him growing up. He and my mother left long before I even got to kindergarten. They were apart. But I just knew of this background, and I was kind of curious about it. I followed the Cuban crises when Kennedy was our president, when Nikita Khrushchev needed to be. Anyway, all that to say that, knowing that I have those roots, my birth name was Dennis Alfredo Fernandez. Dennis Alfredo Fernandez. That name did a lot of things for me. That name let me know that I was different from my family that was rearing me. I was adopted into the name Flash. My mother had remarried George Flash. So anyway, I had this in my background. I couldn't discuss it really with the new parental situation I was living in and growing up in. I was sort of an outsider because everyone had the name Flash and I didn't. And it wasn't until 4th grade that I was adopted. And so I've always been curious about it. And having gotten into ministry and looking for ministry opportunity, I thought my denomination would be well serving if it would consider that we're not involved with Cuba, a mission field, because it's communist. Communists don't teach Christ crucified and resurrected. They'll never receive what the church can bring. And the churches that do exist have often been compromised and co-opted to be company people with respect to communistic ideals. And so it was very easy to run them off the track. So I ended up with another man who had some experience already traveling to Cuba. he, along with me, pulled together some ministers from my denomination, and we went over as a team of 7 people, I think, or 8, and we spent a couple of weeks in Cuba, and that was a royal experience. Uh, there was some energetic, I would say, charismatic, real stylistic, athletic sorts of worship. Um, But it was, and a lot of people were laying their lives on the line, just staying pastors. They were often under intimidation. Some of them have been tortured. Some of them have been mistreated. They're always on the verge of arrest, and the government would like them to be very careful about what they say and how strongly they preach for the good of the people, and what Jesus would have us do in working out our government and working out our community values. So it was a wonderful experience to go down there, to see that historic land, to meet and mingle with people that are under true, deep, and harsh communist oppression, and to get a sense of how does the church function? How does the witness to Jesus Christ and the gospel that speaks grace and goodness and hope to people, how does that play out in a place that suppresses that? And that was the challenge of those men. It remains a challenge today. But we were able, as a result of that trip, to have some involvement with the seminary there, to provide instructors at that seminary from time to time. My ties with Cuba have diminished since then. I'm no longer in the loop on that. But that was a good experience. It brought tears to my eyes just landing in Havana.
And part of your time there, you got to experience, speaking of off the beaten path experiences, I like to document those. You were able to experience dining in these places called paladares,
Yes.
or paladares in Espanol, that are basically they're informal restaurants in people's homes that the Cuban government will sort of,
It's a wink.
they'll allow it, right? What was your experience like there, and what foods did you eat? I'm always curious about that.
Honestly, Lauren, I don't remember the foods, or I couldn't pronounce the names.
Okay.
But the food was great there in the place there was one place that we went that bore this name, and the food was delicious. The people were charming and loving. I don't even know how we figured out how to get in one, because it's sort of exclusive, and you sort of need to whisper your way even to get in it. But we did get into one on a residential street. Keep in mind, that place has been frozen in the era of 1960. Everything came to an end from a developmental standpoint. The cars are 60s and below. Now there are some wealthy, technocrats that rise up and act like capitalists, but anyway, this was a great eating experience. The other places that we could eat would be government-approved institutions that were genuine restaurants. They were so-so. And then when we actually went into like Santa Clara in Cuba, more to the east part of the island, we were out in the boonies. There was one highway that was the pride of Cuba. It went from east to west, all the way across that sausage-shaped island, right? And as you got further and further away from, east, as you got further down east on this highway, there was nobody using the highway. There were no vehicles, nothing. It was like just empty asphalt.
In one of your excursions, you said you went to, you thought it was brightly colorful, and again, frozen in time, was the Isle of Youth?
The Isle of Youth. And the funny thing is that to get to the Isle of Youth, we had to take a prop plane, a multi-engine prop plane, which coughed and smoked, and you thought was going to blow up on the runway. It was a Russian prop plane. I don't know how old it was, but just a little younger than the Wright brothers aircraft at Kitty Hawk. This thing was antiquity. There were people with chickens on it, with animals. Everything just got packed on this plane, and we flew to the Isle of Youth, a small island south of the main island of Cuba. And we saw resorts that were frozen in time, 1950-something era. It was amazing. It was just amazing. So that was more entertainment. I do remember I sailed a Hobie Cat 16
Down in Cuba?
down off the the Isle of Youth, and I took several people there, and we were nearly struck by lightning when we were there. There was a huge crack of lightning, and I could feel the air all around us, and the metal shrouds on the mast. Those were electrified. My hand was on the tiller, and I could feel electricity going through there. We didn't get a direct hit, but we were very close to where it hit directly over the water.
I'll say something about Cuba. I was contemplating going there a few years ago, and I know a couple here in Houston. They do tons of travel. They have a connection with a lady in Cuba who organizes itineraries, who organizes these full trips for people wanting to go into Cuba.
Fun. Wonderful.
And I had everything booked, and at the last minute, I could not go on this trip. And my point for my audience and for you is that this lady, she had this full itinerary, and it was based on what I wanted to do while I was in Cuba. And in order to get permission to really be in Cuba, you need to list your reason for being there.
That's right.
And one of the reasons for my being in Cuba would have been to study art. I was going to be taking classes with a famous painter there, and it was for language learning purposes.
This is all news.
I still have this itinerary saved, and I have this lady's contact information.
You should do it.
I do. She charges a nominal fee. She organizes the whole trip, and of course, it includes going to eat at these little homes, paladares.
Yes.
And being the entrepreneur that I am, loving to support other small businesses.
Knowing the
language. I speak
And the
Spanish as my
culture.
second language. It's really part of my ethnicity in some ways and culture. I'm definitely going to make the trip. But if any of my audience wants me to put you in touch with this Cuba connection I have to organize a trip, I'm happy to do that. And I think it's a great culturally rich, immersive way to experience Cuba. And she was organizing salsa lessons for me, and I was going to have a 4-day itinerary. I was going to be staying in an Airbnb. Tons of Airbnbs are available, highly rated through the Airbnb, ranking system. So that's a little small footnote I wanted to add.
And I will tell you this, that you do have to specify why you're going, give reason, because it's actually the Treasury Department that requires that.
That's right.
And when we went, we had to tell them why we were going, and ours was educational.
That's correct. That's right.
We provided education,
and
we're received.
And in my line of architectural color consultation and color specification, and also being an artist, I have a couple of compelling reasons to legitimately go to Cuba and perhaps even teach seminars on color at some point. I don't know. That is a future trip. But again, to my audience members, if you need any kind of connection to Cuba and you're planning a trip there, do get in touch with me personally, and I will put you in contact with my Cuba contact. Okay, Reverend Flach, a.k.a. Dad.
Yes,
let's talk about one other trip. I think we've got time. But this was not so much missions-based. This was you all went to Spain. And I'd love to hear your take on Spain and why you loved it so much, apart from the ethnic tie, our cultural tie to Spain.
Well, first of all, a few years earlier, my wife, who is Irish, strong Irish background and heritage, her whole family, Irish, everywhere you look. And she looks Irish. She has the red hair and the complexion.
And the beautiful green eyes.
Green eyes like the green of Ireland. And she's just lovely. And just, I had just finished seminary. And she said, let's go to Ireland. I've always wanted to go to Ireland. And so we put our nickels together and we went to Ireland. We spent a week. She let me do some of the planning. She won't let me do that anymore on any of the other trips that we've taken. So I was to drive a small little car to Ireland. Are you asking about?
I was asking about Spain. But it's important a little bit to talk about Ireland because that's the trip you all did to tap into her heritage.
That's right.
And then you got your turn with Spain, and you did things differently in Spain than in Ireland.
For sure.
You did.
So I drove in Ireland, and then when it was time to go to Spain, I said, I'm taking you to Spain. I want you to see my land. We saw your land in Ireland years ago. I want you to go with me. And it's my gift to you. We're going to go to Spain. And I'm going to drive. She said, oh, no. Let's just go to the northeast and watch the leaves change. It was in the fall that we're planning to go. we ended up going to Spain. We went by way of tour, a recommended tour that we took. And it really was a wonderful experience because the tour guide really knew a lot. He was an Englishman living in Spain, and he loved Spain. His wife was a Spaniard. And so they were married, living in Spain, her home, and he was very, very active with educating people about Spain. We went all over the place. We saw a plaza filled with bronze statuaries from Salvador Dali. Let's sing that.
Salvador
Dali.
Salvador Dali.
So Salvador Dali was a beautiful, beautiful work. We went to the Prado Museum, and in fact, we had a chance. The bullfights were not going on at that time. That usually is more in the heated part of the year. But I did go to the bull ring and I saw it, and also we used the transportation systems, and there is a metro system of trains and underground subways and stuff. 2 weeks later, there was a Islamic attack on several cities, Great Britain, London being one, Madrid being another, and there were a couple of other European capital cities that were attacked by Islamists with explosions. There was some, I think, loss of life. But we were 2 weeks before that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But we were in the same places that had been attacked.
What did you love? What most impressed you about Spain?
Well, it was a complex country. I tell you what, I can tell you the effect that it had on me was to read a lot about Spain upon returning. So I read about their civil war between World War I and World War II. What a test ground that was for Germany, because Germany supplied one of the factions. There were two factions, a communist faction versus a hardline right-wing faction of General Franco. And General Franco won the battle, and his forces won. And so for the longest time, he was the dictator over Spain. But anyway, it caused me to read a lot about it, and it's a rich country, but it's got tremendous poverty in it. It's got beautiful first-class cities, and flamenco dancing, art. The museum is fabulous. The Prado Museum is breathtaking. Beautiful, beautiful pieces of work that we have read about. If we're still getting educated in the arts, I don't know that schools are doing that anymore. I hope that they are. So it was a real education. The people were very knowledgeable. They were very warm, a lot of fun. And kind of like New Orleans, for me, great. We ended up traveling out of Madrid, working our way down, hitting a lot of other towns in Spain, getting down to the Mediterranean. We were right near Gibraltar. Gibraltar, you can spit to Africa from standing on the Rock of Gibraltar. Mm-hmm. It's in view. It's right across the channel. And so we were at the end of the Mediterranean when we were down there. So that whole temperature and the climate and all was different than it was in more central parts. So it's varied in its climatology, I guess you would say. There's a lot of Roman structures left. What was interesting, it is one of the places where Islam conquered a lot. Islam had conquered a lot of Europe. And if you know the positioning of Spain's out there, one of the westernmost countries in all of the European continent. Well, their influences were felt especially in Spain. It stopped in Spain. They could go no further except end up in the ocean. And they had they would capture Christian structures and turn them into mosques. They would create beautiful mosques. There's some places that were so elegant and beautiful and palatial. The architecture was breathtaking. Their progress in mathematics and some sciences was incredible and an eye-opener. How cultured the Muslim people were. But they were also radical with respect to, if you're not one of us, you're worthy of death, and we'll see that it happens. So constantly between Christians and Muslim meeting. And sometimes the Muslims would have the advantage and make their way deep into Spain. Other times they'd be driven out and pushed out of Spain to, closer back to the Middle East. And if it was a mosque that they were holding and they got pushed out, that mosque, good likelihood, came a church, a Christian church. Mm-hmm. And so the addresses of Muslim worship facilities and Christian worship facilities changed by who was the stronger person at the time and where was the line of conflict. Where were they dividing?
Fascinating. Very intriguing. So I want to, as we conclude this interview today, I'd like to talk about something you've imparted to me and my brother, Andrew, through the years, is this thirst for knowledge, this love of lifelong learning, appreciation of people and cultures and other points of view, other perspectives distinct from our own. So you are a lifelong learner. You're highly educated. And I want to talk to you particularly about what an avid reader you are. Every time I've seen you, you have 5 books open at one time, and you're reading on any number of topics. So what are your favorite genres, first of all? And secondly, what books are you currently reading?
Well, I think that my category for reading is historical fiction. So I liked Herman Wouk's Winds of War. I like some of the period pieces written by Hemingway in particular. I've loved reading biographies also of people that live lives worth imitating or modeling. I'm taken with the dignities of men and women. I have read biographies or memoirs of Madeleine Albright. I had utmost respect for her and the way she carried herself through the Bosnian conflict. She had blood ties to that land. She was a wonderful woman of real strong positions. I read a biography on Nixon, not as delighting and not as pleasing. Just the harsh realities of being political. Churchill is a fascinating figure to read and learn about, and Manchester put out some wonderful 2-volume set on the life of and the biography of of Churchill, Winston Churchill, and that was one of my favorite reads of all time. I'm quite sure. You gave me a book and I read it and loved it and put it on the shelf, and I'll read it again one day. Called River Why, if I'm not mistaken on the title, but it was a lovely book. It was about a person that was aficionado for fly fishing, which appealed to me at the time. And it was just a wonderful adventure book, but you were very thoughtful, and you tailored that perfectly for my interest. I thoroughly loved that book.
I'm happy to hear that.
And you for giving it to me. I read much theological material. I have periodicals that come to me to keep me abreast of the thoughts, the world of thoughts, insofar as cultures are concerned, and especially those thoughtful writers that try to figure out, well, where are we right now? What does this mean that this occurred, and what are the implications for the way we live after this? I'm overwhelmed by the cruelties that I see today. I am overwhelmed and brokenhearted to see the horrors of World War II repeated again and again and again. The sidelining of certain people of interest to be slaughtered. The recklessness with which no attention is given to civilian populations when there are some ideologies that are in conflict. It's like they're always in the middle, and they become the greater share of the casualties and the wounded and the injured than war should permit. We have degraded. There's no just war out there when you're killing massively the civilians that are caught in just by virtue of locale where they were living, and a war decided to break out there. they are at highest of risk.
Yeah.
It grieves me that we suffer the loss of infants whose only crime is to be inside the uterus of their mother, who contemplates and is coached into terminating human life.
We are indeed living in challenging times, and we've got lots of current events, and we're not sure where to get accurate news. And so some of the publication, can you name a couple of the periodicals you subscribe to
Well,
that you felt to be
they're
as impartial as
Hmm.
as could be?
Well, it's hard to find impartial print. It's quite difficult.
That's true.
It's hard. It's certainly hard now with the segmented news streaming that we get to find impartial television news. You'll get gossip parading as news. You'll get misinformation or hearsay now parading as
Yes.
news.
Well, you had referenced a couple of publications that you enjoy receiving.
Yeah.
That what are those? Maybe just one or two of them.
Kind of. There are three that come to my mind. I'm a Protestant minister in the tradition of Presbyterian, but there are other Christian groups that write and engage the cultures and try to assess where are we now. And it's sort of where are we now in light of the return of Jesus Christ? Where are we? How far along are we? How are we doing in doing church? How are we doing projecting our faith and understandings and moralities? How are we doing with that? So there's some publications that tackle that. Some are going to be philosophical, others are going to be, edgy and political, but some that are relatively sane and focused, not necessarily balanced, because there's some there are some causes worthy of really zeroing in on.
Right.
And so there are three publications. There is a magazine called Plow. It's a periodical. It's got excellent.
Plow.
All of these Plow, Ploughah, like the farm implement.
Okay.
The Plow. And it is. It began with a German group called Bruderhof Community, and there are other communities, but it is basically in an alignment with those of you familiar with the scriptures, with the second chapter of Acts, and how the disciples in Jerusalem, under the hardships of Rome and the persecution by the Jews, they were having to share everything just to live and survive. Well, that's what these communities consist of: mutual sharing, communal sharing, one for all for one kind of an approach. And some of them are holding together, and some of them are really living out that kind of life. It's not for everyone, but the writing, they produce a magnificent periodical, comes out 4 times a year.
I'll have to check it out.
And the reading about the topics of the day are rich, compelling, always with an eye towards our Christian faith and how it's to be expressed. So it's edgy. It'll push otherwise decent, active Christians to rethink. Am I doing enough? Am I engaged enough? Because these people are all in with nothing seemingly in reserve. And their writing shows that. 2 others I'll just make mention of. First Things, which is largely Catholic influence publication. But the Catholics have done a magnificent job in one area for sure, and that is the social issues arising in human sexuality and preservation of life. And that is, they absolutely abhor and strongly stand against and provide reasons for standing against abortion. They're saving infants' lives and persuading people not to pursue abortion, among some other things.
And
then
the third publication.
the third one is called The Christian Century. And it is a left-leaning, in terms of theological understanding, it's somewhat of a left-leaning liberal publication, although it can have some, variations. But they have very interesting articles for the most part. But the most interesting and compelling one are those first two.
Thank you for sharing. And thank you for telling us about the type of literature you enjoy reading.
I do.
Let's end with the question I ask all of my guests, Dad,
What
Reverend
would that be,
Flach,
daughter?
which is, what does it mean to you to live a colorful life? And are you living one? Two-part question.
I think my life has been colorful, and in part that means it's been adventurous. It has had great variety. It has caused me to have to learn a lot of different things because I began being educated in a master's level for special needs children to work with them. I am ending my lifespan of work in ministry that's a master's degree and preparations and so forth of a theological nature. But there have been places in between where I was not in either of those disciplines. And I think of the fact that I worked in outside sales for several years as a representative for a drug company named Mead Johnson. I was promoted within that company to go to the home headquarters in Evansville, Indiana, where I took a position in the marketing department for infant formula products that go to hospitals and take care of newborns, prematures, and special needs babies. And I had to get fluent with that language and lingo. I had to get fluent with the sciences, with the specialties of neonatology, perinatology, and so forth. I also worked for some retail companies, grocery retail companies like an ice cream company, processed meats company. And then I got into, towards the time right before seminary, I worked as the director of marketing for a psychiatric hospital and a chemical dependency program, helping to do the grand opening for the opening of that facility, promoting what they do well to the general population in easternmost New Orleans. And finally, I completed my secular work before going to seminary, working as the coordinator for a program called Drug-Free Schools and Community. And that was in St. Tammany Parish, which is the region north of New Orleans.
So for you, having led a colorful life has a lot to do with adventure, variety, traveling,
reading.
Definitely reading. You have a thirst for knowledge, and I said it before, you are a lifelong learner, and you've definitely imparted this to my brother Andrew and me.
I'm glad.
You have. We are very adventurous, very curious about so many aspects of life, and that does come from you. So our interview is drawn to a close. We've covered many topics, and I really want to thank you, Dad, Reverend Flach, for being here. And
thank you for the opportunity to speak about a place in life, a couple of places in where we've lived, and that has some meaning as I reflect upon it now.
Well, this has been a very informative, it has been an informative two-part series, and we've really done a deep dive into multiple areas of your life, and it has been a life colorfully lived with lots of twists and turns. And to my audience, I want to thank you. I hope that you've listened to the first part of this series with Reverend Dennis Flach, as well as, and I thank you for listening to this piece of the series as well. And I just love having guests who can share fresh, amplified, different experiences, and I will continue to do so as I expand this podcast. If any of you out there in my audience know anyone you think I should interview, please reach out to me through email, and you can do that at lauren@lfbcolor.com. That's Lauren, Lauren, at L, F like Frank, B like boy, color, spelled the U.S. American way, COLOR.com. I would love to hear from you, or if you have any comments or questions about the podcast, please reach out. Until next time, friends, stay colorful, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Coloring My Way Across the Globe. I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation, and we would love to stay connected with you throughout the week. The best way to connect is by subscribing to our newsletter at www.lfbcolor.com. That's www.l as in Lauren, F as in Frank, B as in boy, color, COLOR.com. Also, you may find us on Instagram using the same handle, LFB Color, for the latest stories, podcast guest profiles, travel photography, language learning diaries, and my own colorful art. Hope to see you there, friends. Thank you again.